Well, praise the Lord. We welcome you back to the final session on the journey of Israel. And just as a reminder, we are interested in your questions that you have, but we are not going to end the session early, but rather we're going to complete it to take it to its full end. And then any questions that you have, you can send them in by email. We left off with the thought of discouragement, and we mentioned that discouragement is part of the journey. We get discouraged, we get downcast in our soul, but in the whole equation of our life, we can't begin to accuse the Lord. We can't begin to accuse our leaders. We can't begin to accuse our brethren because we're discouraged in the way. It is a difficult journey going through the wilderness. It's a difficult journey going on to Zion, actually. In fact, we're going to see in this final lesson here that some of the tribes, Gad and Reuben in particular, they are on the journey to Zion with the rest of the children of Israel, and yet they entreat Joshua at that point, and say, if we found grace in your sight, don't bring us over this Jordan. And you'll find that people that you walk with, people that you are in the way with, and they're all saying, let's go to Zion, embracing the message and believing the message. And then through discouragement, for thirst, for hunger, for delay, whatever the case may be, or not even understanding what it is that God is doing in their lives, they say to you, it's enough. We're getting off the journey. We don't want to cross this Jordan. We're going to take our inheritance on the other side of Jordan. We're not going to cross over into the land that God promised to Abraham. And you'll have that. You'll have the separation that will come in people's lives. They get discouraged because of the way. Discouraged because of the way. And we'll find that there were some tribes that actually did not cross the Jordan, or rather they did cross the Jordan to help fight the battles of the Lord. And then they crossed back over to the other side and said, the way, we prefer to be on this side of the Jordan. It's an easier life, less enemies, less struggles. And you'll find that as you are in pursuit of God's best for your life, of God's highest for your life, many times there'll be heartbreak. People still love the Lord, they still serve the Lord, but they get off the journey with you and they no longer are in pursuit of the things that once they pursued. Reuben and Gad were on the journey to the land God had promised to Abraham, and said, it's enough. We're not going to go over Jordan. And they settle for a lesser inheritance. And my encouragement to you is, you want all that God's promised you. You want to be all out for Jesus, as Dr. Bailey used to say frequently. And that means following the Lord all the way to Zion, coming to the place of his habitation. As the Psalms say, the Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. And so by that, what he's inferring, or not inferring, but directly saying, is his desire for the church is to come across this Jordan, come into their inheritance, come up to the place of worship on Zion where the ark dwells, and be all out for God and give everything you can. But you'll find the case. And, the interesting thing is this. They tell you the reasons why, they are choosing a different path, and they make, sense in the natural. But basically it boils down to discouragement, and it boils down to, in one way or another, they feel as though they've lost confidence in the message, or the way is too straight for them, and they would prefer a broader way. And so that is the heartbreak many times of going on in Zion. The heartbreak is that many times there will be separations. Many times there will be separations. And, if you love the Lord and you're seeking the Lord, your heart is broke by the separations, and yet it doesn't defer you. It doesn't take you off course. It doesn't make you question the vision or the veracity or the importance of being all out for God and pressing in all the way. And again, they're still part of the kingdom. We don't criticize them. We don't say that they're a lesser people. We just simply say that they, for one reason or another, choose not to pay the price, choose not to go on, and find a lesser plane to dwell in, because it will end up being in the long run an easier path for them. And so that's where we left off. And so in Numbers chapter 21, verses 6 to 8, we have the event of the brazen serpents. Because of their accusations and their criticism, again, as a result of discouragement, they spoke ill-advisedly, and God released serpents, and those serpents bit them, and many people died as a result of that. And then there was the counsel from the Lord to make a brazen serpent and put it up on a post, and all who looked to the serpent would live. And it was a foreshadowing of Christ. John chapter 3, verse 14, the Lord said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all men unto me. And so the Lord is represented by this brazen serpent. And he took the curse. Actually, he became the curse for us so that we might be saved. In Numbers chapter 21, we also have the well of springing water. It commanded to sing to the well and it would spring up. And this actually becomes an important truth for us, because as we go on in the Lord, through trials in the wilderness, through circumstances as God deals in our lives, at times we can find that the wells of joy and gladness, they can get blocked up. And the counsel is, sing to the well, spring up, O well. They sing to the well, and the well would spring up with life. And it is a truth in the kingdom of God that that there is a power that's released in our worship to the Lord. And while it is probably the last thing that comes to your mind in times of trial and discouragement, I know myself on many occasions I have found comfort and I've found consolation in the midst of my trial to just close your eyes, meditate on the Lord, and just offer a praise to Him and just say, oh God, I trust you. What else can I say? I trust you. And then you feel maybe a little gurgling and a little bubbling in your spirit, and you feel as though you're receiving strength through that. Sing to the well, spring up, O well. And our wells can indeed become blocked. And in the book, it discusses many reasons why wells become blocked. And you no doubt will read that and benefit from those truths. And now we also have in Numbers chapter 22 to chapter 25, we have the story of Balaam and his antics. And Balaam is quite an interesting figure, because you would think that in actuality, for what he had done, he would displease the Lord in causing Israel to sin, and that he would be condemned as a result of it. And yet his own testimony is that he would see the Lord in eternity, but he would see him from afar. He would see him from afar. And that conveys to us, this truth, that if we live lives that are not consistent with good Christian doctrine, if we aren't living a life as a Christian, as a believer, and there is unrighteousness in us, make no mistake about it, it will affect our proximity to the Lord in heaven. And we need to pray, need to cry out, oh Lord, fill me with the character of Jesus. Fill me with the character of Christ, so that in eternity I could be close to you. Now, we come to, we want to read Deuteronomy chapter 2 and verses 1 to 3, because in their journey now, they have come to this mountain, which is basically Mount Seir in Edom. And I want to read with you Numbers chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Then we turned and took our journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as the Lord spake unto me, and we compassed Mount Seir many days. And the Lord spake unto me, saying, Ye have compassed this mountain long enough, turn ye northward. And we equate this event here in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, with the Feast of Trumpets, because there is in our lives at times, and this Feast of Trumpets can be celebrated more than once. I know myself, I can only speak for myself. I was attending, I got saved in a mainline denominational church, a full gospel church, and I was there for some time. I would say probably a little more than a year, a little less than a year and a half. And during that time, I felt the wells drying up within me. I felt as though what this church had wouldn't be sufficient to sustain me in my walk. I was new in the Lord and hungry, and I wanted more. And then there was a trumpet that came forth. There wasn't an audible trumpet, but I reckon it now in retrospect as God blowing his trumpet. And at that time, I met someone at this mainline denominational church who was a kind of a grandmotherly figure in my life, and she began to speak to me of a deeper walk and of a deeper way. And I hadn't heard anything like she was saying. All the things that she was saying were deep to me, and they were satisfying my soul, and I knew I needed to know more, and I kept inquiring of her. I'm calling her, and she lived close to me, and so I was giving her rides to church because she didn't have a car, and asking her all these questions. And then one day she said to me, I won't need a ride anymore. She goes, God is calling me on to a different church. There's a pastor who I knew years ago, and he's starting a work, and God is calling me to that work. And that pastor that she was referring to happened to be Pastor Dan Karam. And I was about 18, 19 years old, and I said to her, you have the words of life to me. Wherever you go, I go. And so I left a church of about 800 to 1,000 people and began attending a home fellowship of 20, 30, 40 committed Christians. And when I went there, it was no longer going there because I was gravitating to the things that this woman was telling me, but now I had the source. I had the pastor who was conveying those things, and it was my own dear pastor, Pastor Dan Karam. And so I've been there ever since, some 40 some years at this point. But it was a trumpet that blew in my life, and it was God saying, it's time to move on. You've compassed this mountain long enough. It's time to move on. And so in my youth, I attended a church that I would not consider to be a church that had any light whatsoever. It was simply the epitome of religiosity. And then God caused me to be saved, and I came out of that church and into a full gospel Pentecostal church. But that church ultimately believed that once you'd been filled with the Holy Ghost, you had arrived and there was nothing else. And then the trumpet blew, and this little Italian woman, grandmotherly figure, began to share with me the deeper things of God and share notes with me, and I began to gobble it all up. And then finally, it led me to Pastor Dan Karam's. And so there is in our lives a time when God does blow a trumpet. Now, in contrast to the children of Reuben and the children of Gad and the tribe of Manasseh, that instead of going on to Zion, said to Joshua, if we found favor in your sight, let us go back on the other side of Jordan. The trumpets is the antithesis of that. Trumpets is you're at a lesser plane, and then you're getting called to a higher plane. And we have seen this at times when God has made that call to people and said, I'm giving you a chance to go higher. And there was a service one time where we heard the prophecy. I didn't hear it. It was actually conveyed to me by one of my family members. But the prophecy came forth and said, would you be willing to leave your father's house to go on with me? And the man gave a resounding no. And so, that's not fulfilling the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets is when deep calls to deep within us. And it's a call to go on to something deeper, a call to go on to something higher, and not to camp and not to just dwell around this mountain top experience that we've had for the rest of our lives, but rather to go on in God. See, the Christian walk is never a walk backwards. It's always a walk forwards. And that's why we know that the tribes that we mentioned, Reuben and Gad and Manasseh, they went the other way. They said, no, let us stay on the other side of Jordan. Well, we want to go on. And so the trumpets speaks of God's voice speaking afresh to us. And so here they were compassing this mountain, and the Lord said, it's enough. It's enough. It's time to go on. Turn ye northward and continue on. And, we want God to speak that into our lives. We want God to blow a trumpet in our lives and to take us from one plane to another. And as I said, this is not something that's fulfilled only once in our lives. This is something that God wants to fill time and time again. I might refer you to Hebrews chapter 6, where Paul said, to them, basically, they'd compass this mountain long enough. Get away from the fundamental things. Get away from the foundational things. You're called into Mount Zion. Press on. Chapter 12 of Hebrews talks about going on to Mount Zion. But in chapter 6, he's saying, when for the time that you ought to be teachers, you have someone come and teach you again the basic things. And that's not where we want to be. We want to hear that trumpet sound, and we want to say, Lord, I'm a-coming. I'm coming, Lord, with you. And I always look for I'm looking for the trumpet most of the time, because I want to go on in God. In Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 3, it talks about bringing many sons to glory. Now, how's that happen? It happens by the trumpet being blown in our lives time and time again, and God calling us onward. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 18 and 22, you're not come unto Mount Sinai, but you are called unto Mount Zion. And so our walk is a continual moving on. Now, we're coming into this section where we're going to be saying goodbye to Moses and saying hello to Joshua. There's going to be the choosing of a new leader. Now, I want to turn back with you to Numbers chapter 27. We're going to talk a little bit here about Joshua being promoted on the scene now. And in Numbers chapter 27 and in verse 15, and Moses spake unto the Lord, saying, Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, which may go out before them, and which may go in before them, and which may lead them out, and which may bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord be not as sheep which have no shepherd. And so Moses is preparing to die. Moses is preparing to hand over the mantle, as it were, to Joshua, as we had already mentioned. Because he smote the rock, he was unable to go in with the children of Israel, and so there was of necessity the need for a new leader. And so Moses is going to die, and Joshua is going to be put in place. And we might mention here that in Jude, it talks about the body of Moses. Moses is one of the few individuals who was resurrected bodily into heaven. In Jude chapter 1, verse 9, he just simply was taken for future ministry. And we know that actually on the Mount of Transfiguration, both Elijah and Moses appeared to Christ as he was on the Mount of Transfiguration, and they were ministering to him in preparation for his death. And we also will see Moses and Elijah having another ministry in the last days, but that's for a different study. We won't get into that now. So we have qualifications, if I could say this, for a leader that Moses, the type of leader that Moses entreats the Lord for. It says, first of all, which may go out before them, which may go out before them. And this really is typifies the relationship that the pastor has with the sheep in the natural, certainly in the natural, but also in the spiritual, that the shepherd goes out ahead of the sheep to see where, there's green pastures, to see where there's good pastures. So the shepherd goes out first, and he tastes of it. And then, he comes back and he leads the flock into that, which may lead them out and which may bring them in. And so let me say this here, how important it is to pray for a shepherd. When I was pastoring a church, when I was a senior pastor some years ago, many years ago now, there was a man in my flock, and he happened to be on my board. And one day, he came in and he announced to me what his ministry to me was. And I thought, praise the Lord, I started feeling warm thoughts, thinking, here's a man who says he has a ministry to the pastor. And so I thought, be a ministry of helps, a ministry of support, maybe a ministry of prayer. But he said, no. He said, my ministry to you is this. Whatever you say, I oppose you. That's my ministry to you. Now, that's a ministry for which I would not want any of the rewards. That is not really God's way. God's desire is for us to lift up our leader, because our leaders are going out and bringing us in. Many times people feel they're more spiritual than their leaders. They're not. In fact, if they felt that way, they proved by that thought itself that they were not more spiritual than their leaders. But you see, the necessity of lifting up the leader and praying, because the leader goes into the green pastures, searches out the green pastures, that he can bring the flock into it. And, they can be rich, but the shepherd goes there first. So the good shepherd anoints them, he feeds them, he lays down his life for his sheep. And if you want to be served well in your church, then pray for your pastor. Pray for your pastor. Your pastors need prayer. Most of the time what they get, well, maybe not most of the time, but many times what they get is criticism. What they really need is prayer, because, they're looking to God to sustain them. They're looking for God to make them good leaders, make them good shepherds, and they need support more than they need criticism. And I think you'll agree with that. And so now the Lord does tell Joshua in verse 18, and chapter 27 of Numbers in verse 18, and the Lord said unto Moses, take thee Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay thy hand upon him. A man in whom is the Spirit. And we could continue on to the rest of the chapter. It talks about God laying his hand upon Joshua and the Spirit of God coming on Joshua, and then Moses lays his hand upon Joshua and charges him. And so now there is the installation of, if I could say this, an installation service of the new leadership that's going to take over. Moses helped, by imparting to Joshua the spirit of wisdom. Deuteronomy chapter 34, verse 9, the spirit of wisdom is imparted to this new leader. And if you're going to be a leader, you need to depend heavily on the wisdom that comes from God. The wisdom that comes from God. So in Numbers, if we look at Numbers chapter 32, go forward to Numbers 32. I just want to read this little portion that we referred to. In Numbers 32 and verse 5. This chapter is the account, starts with the account of them coming to the leader and talking about where they want their inheritance to be. In verse 5 it says, wherefore said they, if we have found grace in thy sight, let this land be given unto thy servants for possession, and bring, now note this phrase, and bring us not over Jordan. And bring us not over Jordan. We're going to be looking at this in a few moments here. The message of Jordan is the message of dying to the old man, of dying to Adam, of putting the old Adamic nature, which is in rebellion to God and cannot be tamed, putting that old nature to death. And they say, do not bring us over this Jordan. Why do people separate themselves from the path of Zion? Why do they separate themselves from the path of holiness? Holiness is a word that scares all of us, to be quite honest. But why do they choose another path? Well, because of the discouragements of the way, and in some cases it's because they don't want to pay the price. Don't bring us over this Jordan. Don't bring us over this Jordan. Well, the important thing is this. The children of Israel always longed for Egypt up until the time that they crossed the Jordan. And when they crossed the Jordan, that desire had been removed from them. And so it's so important in this study on the journey of Israel that we have a deep appreciation for the Jordan River and what it symbolizes and what it represents. We'll see when we get there that Adam specifically, the city of Adam is specifically mentioned because the real truth associated with the River Jordan is putting to death the Adamic nature. Bring us not over this Jordan. Bring us not over this Jordan. There are many reasons that people give for getting out of the way. And if I could just be candid for just a moment, generally speaking, not always, but generally speaking, the reasons people give you for leaving are not really the reasons why they're leaving. They're convenient reasons. They're reasons that nobody can argue with. They seem even noble at times. They certainly make sense to those who are making those choices. But it's very difficult spiritually to cross the River Jordan, to come out of the wilderness and to be confronted with the River Jordan where, there's the crucifying of the old man. The old man is a powerful entity, And the way there is very straight. The gate is very narrow, and few there be that go through it. In no way, shape, or form am I conveying that those who go all the way to Zion are better human beings. In no way, shape, or form am I saying that those who don't go to Zion can't be good and faithful Christians and have an inheritance of their own. But it's not going to be Zion. Don't bring us across this Jordan. And time again, it breaks your heart. You preach and you feel that people understand, and then a family comes to you and they say, we think we're going to get out here. Don't bring us across this Jordan. We're going to get out here. It's important that we cross Jordan. It's important. Trust me, it's very important. Only in eternity will we fully appreciate how important it is not to get off the path, to stay on the journey, to embrace it. When friends separate themselves from you, shed your tears, experience your sorrows, but keep going. Keep moving, keep going onward, keep going upward. They will criticize you, they will call you exclusive, they'll say you're holier than thou, they'll say all of those things, and I've heard them all. And to be honest with you, at this point in my life, they're like water on a duck's back. They just roll right off. I have one singular focus, and that is I want to be with Jesus without the restrictions, without the trappings of my fallen humanity. And it's critical to cross the Jordan in order for that to take place. And so I always find it to be, they're still part of the kingdom, right? I mean, they're still inheriting in the land. They're still part of the kingdom. But they're part of the kingdom that has not crossed Jordan and has not experienced that deep work of circumcision that's done in the heart. You see, the circumcision takes place at Gilgal, which is on the other side of Jordan. And so this is important for us to continue on. Now, before Moses leaves, he repeats the law to the new generation. Deuteronomy, by the way, literally means the second law. And so in Deuteronomy, it's really a series of sermons and exhortations given by Moses to the new generation. Moses looks back and reviews everything that's happened since they've come out of Egypt. And it's also filled with cautions and warnings because he saw that many would forget the Lord who brought them up out of Egypt. He saw and highlights for them that when they get across the Jordan and they get into the land, and this really becomes particularly important when we have the period of the Judges, they are going to get caught up with the other nations. They're going to embrace the abominations of the other nations. And for the 350 years during the period of the Judges, everything that happens, Moses predicted in Deuteronomy that it was going to happen. That they were going to turn their backs on the Lord, and they were going to follow idols, and they were going to get ensnared with the other nations. And that's a teaching for another time. There is a specific teaching on the book of Judges itself. In fact, I just taught that in the Philippines 2 weeks ago, or a week ago. I think it was last week, actually. But so, and it just to give you a very rudimentary definition or background outline for Deuteronomy. In chapter 1 through 11, we have a period of looking back. It's a recount looking back. In chapter 1 through 3, specifically, review of the way since Sinai, looking back of the way since Sinai. And in chapter 4 to 11, we have the review of the law from Sinai. And then in chapters 12 to 34, it's looking forward. So these first chapters are looking back, and we get to chapter 12. Then we're looking forward. So 12 to 34 is looking forward. And in chapter 12 to 30, we have the final rules and warnings to Israel before entering their earthly inheritance. The rules and warnings. And then chapters 31 to 34, the final words and the final actions of Moses before he dies. And then we have the death of Moses in chapter 34, verses 1 through 3. Moses ascends Mount Pisgah, which is near Jericho, and views the promised land, but he's not allowed to go in. And this was such an egregious violation on behalf of Moses that when Moses entreats the Lord says, "Speak to me no more about this matter. Speak to me no more about this matter." Moses was a friend of God, and because of the seriousness of the violation at the rock, when Moses smote it the second time, God said, "You're not going to go in, and don't entreat me anymore on this matter." And so we see the importance of this violation. So Moses had led the people all the way from Egypt to the banks of the Jordan River, from Egypt to the banks of the Jordan River. Now Joshua is going to lead them into the land of promise. However, we have to conclude this, because we have the whole 350-year period of the Judges, that Joshua is going to lead them into the land of promise. However, not even Joshua is going to bring them into the rest. And therefore, we have this statement in the book of Hebrews where it says, if Joshua had given them rest, then we would have not sought for another rest, but there remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. And that's highlighted in Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4, where it talks about the rest of God. So Joshua is going to become the new leader, but even Joshua would not bring them into full rest. And the enemies that are left in the land many times are left there for a reason, and that's highlighted for us in Judges chapter 3, where it says the Lord left the enemies in the land so that the children of Israel might learn warfare, even the new generation that grew up that didn't know the wars and the battles. And then the nations are left, the enemy nations are left in the land also to try God's people and to test them, as Moses said, in reference to the time period of the Judges, that they would fall into idolatry and embrace the ways of the other nations. And so God tested God's people with the enemies in the land. And you find that is spiritually still the case today. You ask yourselves, why does that person still struggling in that area? They're trying to overcome, and yet there's some enemy that still has ascendancy over them. Well, God is teaching that individual, that Christian, how to do warfare and how to defeat the enemy and how to overcome the enemy by the enemy's presence. And then God tests that individual and says, are you going to continue to fight against that enemy? Or are you going to cast off restraint, give in to that enemy, and accept the abominations of the other nations, as it were, speaking in terms of the book of Judges here. And so now we come to the crossing over into the Jordan. Joshua, as the new leader, is going to take them into, he's going to further the journey with them and lead them across the Jordan. And as I said, this is actually one of, I would consider to be the most important, one of the most important truths in the journey of Israel. Because anyone that doesn't come, or isn't coming, I should say, to Zion through the River Jordan isn't coming at all. There has to be, in order to come into the Holy of Holies, in order to come into the place where God's literal presence dwells, there has to be a putting away of that which offends. And the Adamic nature, we're told that the human mind is at enmity with God and can never submit. So there has to be a putting to death of the old man. And when we talk about a putting to death of the old man, does that mean that you'll never again for the rest of your life be tempted? No, that's not what it means. That's not what it means. What it means is this. It means that you come into a place in your Christianity whereby you have, by the grace of God and the work that's been done in you through the Holy Ghost and through this Jordan experience, you have the ability, when faced with temptation, to say, I will not. I will not yield. But rather, as Romans says, you become more than a conqueror, and you yield yourself servants to righteousness. Servants to righteousness. The temptation comes in, the enemy comes in, just as Christ at the temptation in Matthew's gospel, as the enemy comes in, he is more than equal to the enemy. And so when we cross the Jordan, we become more than equal to the enemy. And we could say maybe the enemy is outside externally, yes. But more importantly, it's the bearing within us, how we conduct ourselves, how we carry ourselves, how we, address ourselves and commend ourselves before God as Christians, as believers, as examples of godly men and women. And so Joshua has God's reassurance that he's going to be with him. And this is vitally important for Joshua because he's going to face many enemies. In the Joshua campaign, they're going to cross the Jordan and they're going to be confronted immediately with battles and warfares. And for the entirety of Joshua's leadership almost, they're fighting the battles of the Lord. And so fighting the battles of the Lord is more than just overcoming external enemies. Fighting the battles of the Lord is fighting the enemies within. Fighting the enemies within. And somebody, I wish I could recall, maybe those that are experts on Google will do a research. There was a book that was written some time ago that listed all of these 31 kings and what they could represent internally within our own human nature. And so in Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, now after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spake unto Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' minister, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, thou and all this people, unto the land which I do give them, even to the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that I have given unto you, as I said unto Moses. I just want to stop there for just a moment. There is this place, in God where you can be sent to a place and you say to yourself, maybe you're diverted. Maybe you're taking a flight and you're accidentally diverted somewhere. I remember going to a place one time. I was asked to go to a place that I had never in my life ever thought about going to. And somehow I felt at ease in my spirit about going there. Somehow I felt in my spirit there was something to it. And when I got to that nation and I disembarked off the plane and I began to go throughout this country, in this particular city, there were at least 3 specific cities that I passed through while I was there. I felt God speaking to me. I felt God saying, pray for an inheritance in this place. And you know what? That was some years ago, many years ago now, and I still feel the burden for that place, and I'm still praying, oh God, bring me back to that place. And I had opportunity to teach and preach in that place, and I said, oh God, give me fruit where the soles of my feet have trod. This place which I never contemplated, and yet you sent me there. And sometimes there are these divine appointments when God sends you to a city or sends you to a place and you say, oh God, give me fruit in this place. Give me fruit in this place. And so they were given an inheritance among all the places that their feet trod upon. And in verse 5, there shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. I will not fail thee, nor forsake thee. And I think it's critically important. I know it's critically important that we listen We listen to what God says to us. What I find happens in many instances, that God speaks a promise, but because it takes years for it to be fulfilled, we grow weary. We begin to question whether God spoke it. And then in the process of time, we lose confidence in God fulfilling his word, and we divert off the path. That's a tragedy. That is a tragedy. That's a tragedy. We ought to believe that he's faithful who promised, and he will also bring it to pass. And so it's tragic when the people of God lose confidence in what God has spoken. As I was with Moses, so Joshua will I be with thee. You know, I just recently preached a message up at Zion, and I think it's going to be coming out in one of the videos sometime in the future here. But, you know, it was one of the verses in this message was that the people came to Jesus and they said, what shall we do to work the works of God? And Jesus turned to him and he said, the work of God is to believe. The work of God is to believe. It's not talents. It's not anointings. It's not giftings. It's not how well you can preach or how many hours in a day you serve the Lord. No, the work of God is to believe. If you believe what God has spoken to you, if you believe what God has spoken to you, then you'll see it come to pass. Don't waver. Don't doubt God. Don't question it. Don't get discouraged. Don't say this, don't bring me across the Jordan. Let me stay on the side of the Jordan. No, you say, I'm going to go. Recently, I was facing a battle myself, and, you know, I felt the enemy rising on every side. And I said, Lord, this enemy has been an enemy that's been in my family for generations. And yet, if I find favor in your sight, you're more than capable of defeating this enemy. And I believe it. I have believed it ever since I've been a Christian, since I was 18 years old. Well, some things God speaks to you, he fulfills them in a snap. They're fulfilled. Other things, oh, they can take decades. But you never stop believing in the promise of God. Please, I beg of you, never stop believing. Never stop believing. God will fulfill his word. As I mentioned, I'm currently putting together a little study that shows from Abraham all the way to Solomon's temple, God, in spite of all of Israel's history, in spite of their ups or downs, whatever leader was in charge, whether they were good, bad, or whatever, at the end of the day, God did exactly what he said he would do. He did exactly what he said he would do. The promise he gave to Abraham, you know, produced Solomon's temple, which was observed literally by the world, at least the world in those days. The fame of it spread throughout the world. And God fulfilled in the natural what he had promised to Abraham. But then, of course, there's the spiritual, which is the church as well. So God speaks this to Joshua, that he's going to be with them. And so we know certain things about the life of Joshua. We know that Joshua was a seeker of the Lord. He was the servant of Moses. And many times when Moses advanced into a greater presence of the Lord, we find Joshua is there right alongside of him. And there are times actually where, you know, Moses went out from the presence of the Lord to go and deliver the message to the people. And it specifically says that Joshua stayed longer. He stayed in God's presence longer. My pastor told me years ago at a convention one time, he's sitting in the convention, the service has been dismissed and everybody's going out to lunch, and he's sitting still in the service. And so I noticed it and I observed it, and I said, are you going to go get lunch? And he said, when God is still here, then stay longer. And so in the church that I pastored, that made an impression on me, in the church that I pastored, I had this phrase that I used to say to the people all the time. I said, when God is speaking, you be seeking. When God is speaking, you be seeking. And Joshua was this kind of man. In Exodus chapter 33, verses 8 to 11, Joshua is learning to receive from the Lord in His anointed presence, learning to receive from the Lord in His anointed presence. And I have found this to be the case. Again, it's not talents, it's not giftings, it's not, the ability to do this, that, or the other. Many times a person is promoted and advanced strictly because they've received an impartation from the Lord. And so Joshua was such a man. Probably simply one of the most important qualifications in the life of Joshua was his ability to stay in God's presence. It's a wonderful treat to be able to stay in God's presence. Now, let's look for a moment at another attribute, another quality of Joshua. I want to turn with you to Numbers chapter 14. In Numbers chapter 14, this becomes a very important attribute for a leader to possess. Numbers chapter 14, beginning in verse 7. And they spake unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, The land which we passed through to search it is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delight in us, then He will bring us into this land and give it us, a land which floweth with milk and honey. Only rebel not ye against the Lord, neither fear ye the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. But all the congregation bade stone them with stones, and the glory of the Lord appeared, and so forth. But in verse 10 there, they came back with a good testimony of God's ability to bring them in the land, and the people sought to stone them with stones, to put them to death. They were so agitated by the testimony. But here's Joshua, this man who was right when everybody else was wrong. Everybody else was wrong. And Joshua was right. But he didn't get swayed by the people. Instead, he continued to stand behind his choice to believe in God. He still stood on his faith in God. He still stood in the testimony that if the Lord delight in us, He will give us this land. And even though the people opposed him, and even though the people threatened to stone him, he held, to the standard. And that is really a very rare thing in a leader. Obviously, a leader, one of the qualities of being a leader is to be able to flex when it's time to flex, but to be able to stand rigidly strong against the onslaught when you know that your cause is just, and you know that you're on God's side, and that you're testifying of the goodness of the Lord, and you're not going to be swayed otherwise. And so we have this beautiful attribute of Joshua, that he was able to stand before the people and still say, if God delights in us, He is well able. They criticized him, they cursed him, they threatened to kill him with stones, but he said, if God is with us, we can do this. And he fell on his face and he said, don't do this evil thing before the Lord. And the other thing that we understand concerning Joshua is his loyalty to Moses. His loyalty to Moses. His loyalty to Moses. Sometimes people will come to you and will try and get you to usurp. They want to promote you. And they say, well, we think that you should be the one. And they want you to usurp and take the reins from a leader that's over you. My advice to you, don't do it. Don't do it. Step back and say, I am not going to do this. When my first pastorate, as I mentioned before, there was a man who had, he had been unrighteous with his responsibilities, and it had come to light, and I was purposely there as interim pastor while this man was being censured. And then came time for the board to get together, and they said, we don't want you to be interim pastor anymore. We want you to be the full pastor. And so the time came for the vote, whether to vote this man out and vote me in. And they said to me, what is your vote? And I said, my vote is nothing. I will not vote a man out so I can take the reins. We have a senior board at Zion. We have a board in the local assembly. I'm stepping out of it. Whatever you guys decide, I'll be obedient to, but I'm not going to vote this man out. And so I just decided I am not going to enter into the ministry by voting a man out. Someone else can do that. I'm not going to touch him. There are his leaders, his authority, those that he submits to, that let their votes count. And if they say that I'm not the guy, I'll submit to it. If they say I'm the guy, I'll submit to it, but it won't be, I won't cast a vote. I just feared, casting a vote and starting out my ministry by casting a vote to vote a man out of his ministry. That's a rather tall order. And so here we see the loyalty of Joshua. He was loyal to Moses. In fact, one of the commendations we have concerning Joshua that we find in the scriptures is that he fulfilled all the things that God had spoken to Moses. Isn't that interesting? He wasn't in it for the ambition for himself, but rather he received the vision from Moses. It had been delivered to him. He didn't put his own spin onto it. He didn't put his own flair onto it. He didn't put his own personality into it, Joshua's ministry, abroad, so forth. No, it says his commendation was that all the things that God had commanded to Moses, Joshua obeyed. And Moses had been long dead. And so how very important it is for us to be loyal to those God puts over us. If I could just make this one simple comment here. I've never seen anyone rise up against a leader and be blessed in the end. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way. And so here we have another qualification of Joshua, that he is loyal. So one of the things also is the congregation needs assurance concerning their new leader. And so we find that in Deuteronomy chapter 31 again, verses 3 to 8. Then we have the death of Moses, and Joshua, is full of the Spirit. Moses dies, God himself buries him, and, Joshua is now the man who clearly has God's hand on his life. In Joshua chapter 1, all the way from verses 1 to verse 19 of Joshua chapter 1, to verse 18, are all instructions that God gives to Moses. But probably one of the most important things that God speaks to to Joshua in verse 9. Well, we could read verse 8, which is a very famous verse, and then we'll read verse 9 as well. This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success. Verse 9, have not I commanded thee, be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed, for the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. The Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. And again, as we embark upon this journey to Zion, we must always keep and bear in mind that the Lord is with us on this journey. There are plenty of times in the life of a believer when things aren't happening, when God isn't moving, when it feels perhaps even like you've been somewhat forsaken. But we've got to judge him faithful who promised. We've got to look to, the one who gave us the promise. Of course, our promises are delivered to us by our leaders because they're the ones that God spoke to. But hopefully, in our own lives, God's quickening things to us as well, and God is speaking to us as well. And we have to hold firm on that thing. So many times you find people, they lose confidence in what God has spoken. And many times I find that people lose confidence because, maybe the changing of leadership. So we go from Moses, and Moses was the man of God with the vision. Moses was the deliverer. Moses was, demonstrated all the powerful signs and wonders in coming out of Egypt, and all of the miracles in the wilderness and so forth. And then we have Joshua. He's different. The whole ministry is different. The whole flow is different. The whole journey changes. Everything changes. And yet, God is with Joshua as he was with Moses. Even though the whole structure of the journey now takes a completely different twist. Joshua takes over as we're crossing the Jordan, as we are going to experience the circumcision at Gilgal, and as we're going to be confronted with the 31 kings. None of this took place in the wilderness. That's not what Moses did. That's not how Moses did it. But we have to see God in different leaders. We have to see God in the different leadership. Styles change, techniques change. We have to see God is the one who's directing. It's not, I have found over the years that God fulfilling his promises depends very little on man. No matter who's there, no matter who's running, whether it's Moses, whether it's Joshua, whether it's Othniel who's going to be the first judge. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. We just have to conclude that God is in it, and we have to remain faithful to see his promises fulfilled and come to pass. I recently said to somebody this. In fact, I said it multiple times in the last couple of weeks, and it's come up almost in every single teaching and preaching that I've had in the last couple of months. I said, I know what God has spoken to me. I haven't seen it fulfilled. Some things I have, but many things I haven't seen God fulfill. And I'm believing God for it. But let me tell you something. Let me just say something about me. If I die, which I'm not expecting to, but you never know. If I die and I don't see these things fulfilled before I die, when I stand before Jesus, when I stand before God the Father, I will never be ashamed that I waited. I will never be ashamed that I waited, that I didn't divert off the path, and I didn't say, no, don't take us across this Jordan. We don't want to go across the Jordan. I will never be ashamed that I waited. I will never be ashamed that I waited for God. I am a firm believer that everything you need to know, God tells you when you need to know it. And if God tells me to do something and I do that, and in the course of doing that, I, pass away, when I stand before God, I'm only going to have to give account for the things he spoke to me. So if God's given me a promise, I don't care if it was 40 years ago, and I find myself believing that promise and walking in a way, in a manner that would, qualify me, if I could say that, to receive that promise, and yet I die before the promise is fulfilled, I will never be ashamed that I waited. I will never be ashamed that I waited. If I never see revival, if I never see God's promises fulfilled, I will never be ashamed that I waited. I will never apologize for waiting. So many times people get so anxious and they just want to move and do something. No. Wait. And in God's good time, he'll bring it to pass. But if you pass, it says Abraham died in faith, not having received the promise. Well, he's going to. But I remember one time the Lord had spoken to me, and I was, how shall I say this, pouring out my complaint maybe, I guess would be the best way of saying it, to the Lord about something he had spoken. And his reply back to me was wait. And then he followed it by saying this: who told you that promise was even for this dispensation? And it changed my whole thinking on it. I began to think to myself, do we hold God to task over what he said? Well, we want to believe God, and we certainly want to pray and say, Lord, you spoke it. That's believing God. But isn't it really the prerogative of God to execute his own timetable in his own way? We pray and we seek, but if it doesn't happen, then you keep waiting, you keep believing. I will never be ashamed. I will never be ashamed that I waited. I will never be ashamed. And so now we come to the crossing of the River Jordan. And this equates with the Feast of Atonement. And the Feast of Atonement really is a unique feast because all the feasts were actually feasts of rejoicing. But this was a Feast of Atonement. This was one feast where actually you got in trouble if you rejoiced. It was actually a day of soul searching. And of course, we're talking about crossing the River Jordan. And so therefore, it is not a time of rejoicing. It's a time of exposing the old man and having him put to death. Now, when we come to Joshua chapter 3, as I mentioned earlier, we have the account of God makes sure that the name Adam is addressed in relationship to the River Jordan. in relationship to the River Jordan. And I want to read with you in chapter 3 of Joshua, beginning in verse 15. In Joshua chapter 3, verse 15, it says, "And as they that bear the ark were come unto Jordan, and the feet of the priests that bear the ark were dipped in the brim of the water, for Jordan overfloweth all his banks all the time of harvest, that the waters which came down from above," in other words, upstream, the waters that came down from upstream, "and rose up upon an heap very far from the city Adam, which is beside Zaratan, and those that came downward toward the sea of the plain, even the salt sea, failed and were cut off. And the people passed over right against Jericho." And so here we have it. They come to the River Jordan, and it's overflowing its banks at this time, because this is, a time when in Israel's timetable when there was much rain, and so the Jordan overflowed its banks. But when the priests' feet touched the River of Jordan, as they approached it, and as their feet touched the River of Jordan split, as it were, and the stream ran out and trickled down, and no more water came down, and the water began to backfill all the way up to the city of Adam. And in the city of Adam, there was a big wall of water while the children of Israel crossed. The important thing is this. The important thing is Adam speaks of the first Adam, speaks of the sinful nature. It speaks of the old man. It speaks of that part of our nature which is dealt with in the spiritual experience of the River Jordan, which equates with the Feast of Atonement, And so Adam speaks of the old sinful nature, and it is always from Joshua chapter 3, verse 15 and 16, that we jump forward into the New Testament and turn to the book of Romans and Romans chapter 6, because Romans chapter 6 equates the death to self message with the cutting off of Adam. In Romans chapter 6, I want to begin reading in verse 4 so we can kind of get a flow here. It says, "Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. For if we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we should also be in the likeness of his resurrection." And so now, when we talk about what took place at the Red Sea, we already established that spoke of water baptism. They went down into the sea and they came up on the other side, and that speaks of water baptism. And in our water baptism, there is a symbolic event that's taking place. It's one of the few rituals that actually is retained in the New Testament church of baptizing people, because it's the association with the death and resurrection of Christ. But it is only an association. I mean, there are some things that are completed in water baptism, but water baptism is really in itself as a type of what takes place in the River Jordan. In the River Jordan, in water baptism rather, we are in type experiencing what will be experienced in reality at the River Jordan. In the River Jordan, again, we went down, but something different happened when we come out the other side of the River Jordan. There were certain events that took place. First of all, they took 12 stones and put them into the midst of Jordan, and then they took 12 stones and took them out, 12 different stones, and took them out and put them on the other side. And so this was, again, the death of the old man into the Jordan, and then newness of life coming out of the Jordan on the other side. And then something else that took place after they crossed the River Jordan, they all had a fresh circumcision. And the truth of circumcisions, which we learned from Colossians, in the book of Colossians, that there's a spiritual association with circumcision, and that is a cutting away of that which we were born with, a cutting away of the old man, a cutting away of the flesh, a cutting away of that part of our nature which makes us fall short of the glory of God, a cutting away of that, so that we can live in newness of life, in the newness of Jesus, and experience a walk with him where, like Christ, we can say, I do those things that please my Father. I don't yield to temptation, but I yield to the righteousness of God. So therefore we have water baptism, which typifies what experientially takes place in the River Jordan. And in the River Jordan, that experience relates to the very next verse in Romans, and that is Romans chapter 6 and verse 6. In Romans 6, it says this, knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. This is the gospel message. This is the message. Not that, Jesus should die on the cross so that we could live our lives however we want to, and when he looks down from heaven, all he sees is little Jesus is walking around. Well, that certainly wasn't the case in the Corinthian church, where Paul said, you're doing sins that are not even mentioned among the Gentiles. It's certainly not in the Galatian church when Paul says, I stand in doubt of you who had bewitched you. Why do you believe a gospel that's not a gospel? So this idea of becoming saved, and then all of a sudden Jesus just smiles at us no matter what we do, is fallacious. It's false. You can dismiss it. No, we come to Romans chapter 6, verse 6, where it says, knowing this, that our old man has been crucified. And this idea of knowing is more than just intellectual knowledge. It's a knowledge that's experientially. When a mother, sees the child playing in the kitchen and she's cooking on the stove, she says to the child, don't touch the stove, it's hot. Well, the child is familiar enough in the world of things to know that hot is bad, but it's still just kind of intellectual knowledge. And so mom gets a phone call, she goes over, she answers the phone, and little Johnny says, I'm going to go touch the stove. And so he'd been instructed, he knew intellectually that he wasn't supposed to touch the stove because it's hot, but then he goes over, and mom has to hang up the phone because little Johnny's screaming because he burned his hand. Now he knows the stove is hot. It's no longer intellectual, but he knows that he knows that he knows. And this is the idea that Paul's talking about. And I want to touch on something here. Last week at Zion, I was teaching 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and we ran into a problem in 1st Thessalonians where Paul was teaching on the second coming, and he teaches so much in the present tense that the poor Thessalonians quit their jobs and were standing around waiting for the Lord to come. And Paul had to write another letter saying, he's not coming yet. There's certain things that have to take place. The man of sin has to be revealed and so forth. So get back to work, get back to your jobs. But Paul frequently talks and teaches many times in present tense. And so as we have in Romans chapter 6 and verse 6 here, knowing this, that our old man is crucified, and many people have declared, Paul said, knowing this, the old man is crucified. No. Listen, you're crucified when you're crucified. But were the Corinthians crucified? No, they weren't crucified. They're moving in the gifts and they're carnal. The Galatians weren't crucified. And actually, to be quite honest with you, most of the New Testament is written to either correct erroneous doctrine or bad behavior. So we can't say that once we've come to Christ and accepted Christ as our Savior that the old man is crucified. Listen, they were delivered from Egypt. It was going to be a long time before they crossed the River Jordan. They're not happening simultaneously. And Jordan, the waters are rolled back to the city of Adam. Adam is dispatched. Adam is dealt with. And Paul is telling us that the old man is crucified. The Adam is crucified, when we experience it. It didn't happen as soon as we came out of Egypt. It didn't happen when we started reading the Word of God, the unleavened bread. It didn't happen when we were water baptized. It didn't happen when we were filled with the Holy Ghost. It didn't happen when the trumpets blew. It happens at the Day of Atonement on the River Jordan. That's where this verse comes into its existence. And I've met a lot of people that have suffered great condemnation in their lives because they think they're being bad Christians because if I've been crucified with Christ when I got saved, why do I still have lust? Why do I still have anger? Why do I still have a temper? Why do I still have all of this stuff? Well, it's because you weren't crucified with Christ when you got saved. You weren't crucified with Christ when you were water baptized either. No, being crucified with Christ is coming to this place where we know that the old man has been put to death. And what is a definition of the old man? Well, we have the example of Galatians chapter 5, where it talks about the works of the flesh. We have the Galatians of Colossians chapter 3, where it talks about the old nature and the old man. So the crossing of the Jordan is significant to the children of Israel because it starts a new phase in their journey, but it's very significant to us because it is a place where we are crucified with Christ. And so we have in Joshua chapter 4 and verse 19, and this is what took place on the other side of Jordan, as I mentioned. Chapter 4, Joshua chapter 4, verse 19, and the people came up out of Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and encamped in Gilgal in the east border of Jericho. And those 12 stones which they took out of Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, when your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean ye by these stones? Then you shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land. For the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan before you, until you passed over the Jordan as you did in the Red Sea. And then this became the place in chapter 5. We learned that the children of Israel experienced a fresh circumcision here. And we have already mentioned what the spiritual truth concerning circumcision is. And so again, the Romans 6 experience renders the old man dead. We have the importance of the circumcision, the message of the circumcision, the cutting away of the flesh. And now we come to the end. We're going to start bringing things towards the end here. And we want to now transfer over to the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, as we said, Joshua circumcised the children of Israel. And then, there were some 31 kings that had to be dispatched by the children of Israel. And then Joshua comes to the end of his ministry. And then, Joshua, as it were, kind of hands over the reins to Othniel, so to speak. He becomes the very first judge during the period, the 350 years of the judges, 350 years of backsliding. I mean, how else can you say it? There were really only two judges that I would consider to be of a character where there were no negative things said about them, and they would have been Othniel and Deborah, but the others all had a mixture of one kind or another. The people mixed themselves with the other nations, on and on, 350 years, until finally that 350 years culminates with the birth of Samuel the prophet. Samuel the prophet, who was a mighty man of God, who was anointed to enter, to bring, as it were, the people of God into an entirely new dispensation. At the time of the judges would pass away, Samuel would anoint Saul to be king, and then ultimately he would anoint David to be king, and David would be the one who actually brings the children of Israel into Zion. And this experience equates with the Feast of Tabernacles. And so if you want to read concerning the Feast of Tabernacles, we have Leviticus chapter 23, verses 33 to 43. Joshua was only able to lead the children of Israel into partial rest, and the Israelites became slack, as we said, during the time of the judges, made alliances with enemies. In the time of the judges, it says every man did that which is right in their own eyes. What did God say to Joshua? Meditate on this law and do everything in it. That way you'll make your way prosperous and you'll have good success. But unfortunately, the children of Israel did not do that, and they began to depart. Now, we talk about all of the feasts that we highlighted from Passover all the way up here to the Day of Atonement. We mentioned at the beginning of the study that those were historical for Israel, but they also were experienced in the church. And we'll highlight specifically three for confirmation of that. We had the Passover, right? The Passover, which took place when Jesus Christ rose from the dead, or was crucified and rose from the dead. And then we have Pentecost, which took place on the day of Pentecost. And the only thing that now that we're waiting for is the Feast of Tabernacles, which will be the feast which culminates with the second coming itself. It will be the feast of our day. Now, I want to say one thing first of all about David. Let's look into 2 Samuel chapter 5. And in 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 6 and 7. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem unto the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except thou take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither, thinking David cannot come in hither. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion. The same is the city of David. And so here we have David now has taken what we might refer to as the last stronghold, which were the Jebusites. And if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 7, and it talks about the 7 enemies of the Lord, the last enemy that's mentioned are the Jebusites. And so with David and ultimately with his son Solomon, we see the culmination of this journey of the children of Israel. This place, Zion, would eventually be God's resting place. The scriptures say that God desired it for his habitation. God desired it for his habitation. We would say, God will say that the Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. All the places that Jacob dwelled, all the places that Jacob was at, all even of the tribes, all of the, on this east and west of Jordan, all of the nations, or rather all of the tribes that settled throughout the nation. It says that the Lord loves the gates of Zion more than all the dwellings of Jacob. Now, again, we're not preaching exclusivity here because this is open to everyone. It's not exclusive just to us. It's open to everyone. But even Paul picks up in Hebrews chapter 12. We've been called to Mount Sinai. Not called to Mount Sinai. We've been called to Mount Zion. We've been called as a church. Paul is preaching to the church. We have been called to Mount Zion. But you will find that as you go on this journey to Mount Zion, that many who start the journey with you will not finish it. Because trust me, the closer you get to Zion, the more straightened, the more narrow is the way. And we've learned from Jesus that narrow is the way. Narrow is the way. Broad is the way that leads to destruction. But narrow is the way that leads to holiness. And Zion is a place of holiness, a place that God chooses to dwell. And so this eventually became God's resting place. So our message, and we can't be apologetic about this. People accuse you of being exclusive, holier than thou, all of that. You can't help that. I mean, people who get off the path because it's too straight, what else are they going to say? What else are they going to say other than, they're not going to come around and say, yeah, we decided holiness wasn't for us. The best thing to do is to knock down those who are on that road. But when I was preaching, or teaching, I should say, at Zion last week, one of the things I said to the students there, I said, don't dumb down the message. Don't dumb down the message. God's message for the church, not because we bear it as a fellowship, but it's in Hebrews chapter 12 that we're called to Mount Zion. Don't dumb down the message. Because if you make your message just the elementary things, then you're going to have a church full of babes, and they're never going to come to full maturity. Those that are dwelling on Zion, they are there because they made a consecrated effort to get there, and God has led them on that journey, and they have surrendered all to get there. They're not babes. They're mature sons and daughters. Now, it's necessary. In fact, in the upcoming revival, we're going to see a tremendous influx of people coming into the church who have never even heard of Zion. They have no idea what that's talking about. And when you preach your message of Zion, you're going right over their heads. In those instances, you create primary Sunday schools, you create introductory Bible studies, you create introductory classes and so forth, but you preach the highway of holiness. It'll go over their heads in the beginning, but trust me, if a person's hungering for God, if a person wants to meet with God and they want to go to Zion, they'll search it out. If you think about it, I mean, myself, when I first started going to Pastor Dan's church, I didn't know anything he was talking about, but something in my spirit bore witness with what was being said. And I said, I need to search this out. I need to discover it. There's something important in here that I need to know. So you preach the message of holiness. You preach the message of Zion. And even though in yourself, you can't say that you're holy yet. In yourself, you may say, I have not crossed the river Jordan yet. In yourself, you may say, I have not crucified the flesh yet. You preach it, you preach it, you preach it. People will complain sometimes, and they'll say the messages are going over everybody's head, but you continue to preach it. You continue to preach the high and holy way. If there's necessity of creating a primary class so that folks can get caught up, then create a primary class. But you keep teaching the highway of holiness. Now, we have basically, and we're bringing it to a close here, we have about 10 minutes left in the session here. We have about 7 aspects of this Feast of Tabernacles. The first aspect of the Feast of Tabernacles, it is the Feast of Glory. It is the Feast of Glory. The Feast of Tabernacles, all the other feasts pale in comparison to the Feast of Tabernacles. And as I said, this is a feast for the last days church. Passover has been experienced. Pentecost has been experienced. Tabernacles has yet to be experienced. The Feast of Glories. Solomon's dedication of his temple took place on the Feast of Tabernacles, and the glory came down so strong at the dedication of Solomon's temple that the priests fell down slain in the spirit and couldn't even stand to minister because of the glory. And one of the things it says concerning the last days, that darkness will cover the earth, but the Lord shall arise, and his glory shall be seen upon you. In the last days, there will be gross darkness, but there's going to be great glory. Great, great glory. And where's the Feast of Tabernacles celebrated? It's celebrated on Zion. It's celebrated on Zion. The Feast of Tabernacles equates with David taking the hill of Zion. It is also the Feast of Joy. In John chapter 7, Jesus declared on the Feast of Tabernacles, in John chapter 7, it is the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, he declares, out of your belly shall flow rivers of living water. Out of your bellies shall flow rivers of living water. And it speaks to us of joy. And so the Feast of Tabernacles is a feast of joy. It's a feast of rest. It is the 7th and final feast. And the 7, as we know, speaks of rest. God rested on the 7th day, and so it is a feast of rest. Hebrews tells us that there remains a rest for the people of God. What is the rest? The rest equates with, the crucified life. It equates with circumcision. It is resting from our labors, resting from sinful works and sinful labors. And so during the Feast of Tabernacles, there will be an entering into rest for the Church of God. It is the Feast of Restoration. In Nehemiah chapter 8, it talks about, the restoration era. In Nehemiah chapter 8, the Feast of Tabernacles was restored during the restoration era. And so, it speaks of restoration. And so we have the idea of the backsliders. I've had a heart myself for the backsliders for many years. In fact, I had a radio broadcast for about 4.5 years, and the mission statement that the Lord gave me for that radio broadcast was, return to your Father's house, return to your Father's house. And so there will be tremendous restoration of the backslider during the Feast of Tabernacles. And it also can be referred to as the Feast of Ingathering. Again, in John chapter 7, if any man thirst, let him come unto me. This was something that Jesus declared during the Feast of Tabernacles in John chapter 7. If any man thirst, let him come unto me. And so there will be a great ingathering of new converts and new believers. One of the vibrancies of the church is new believers. People coming in, hungering for God, hungering for good doctrine, hungering for, the care that comes in the house of God. If any man thirst, let him come unto me. It is the Feast of the Latter Rain. We also have the wedding at Cana, where we're told the governor declares to the keeper of the governor of the wedding that they had saved the best wine for last, the best wine for last. And so, the Feast of the Latter Rain, saving the best wine for last. there's also a reign that takes place in Israel during this time, and that reign that takes place is 7 times greater than the rain that takes place when they're planting earlier in the year. So it is the feast of the latter rain. And then one of the most important aspects of the Feast of Tabernacles, this is what we should look for, and why we know that this is going to take place in the last days, is the 7th aspect to the Feast of Tabernacles is that it is the feast of his appearing. The feast of his appearing. As we mentioned in John chapter 7, Jesus was hidden as they went to Jerusalem, and then he made his appearance. He revealed himself during the Feast of Tabernacles. He appeared in the temple and revealed himself on the Feast of Tabernacles in John chapter 7. And so the Feast of Tabernacles will take place in the church. As the church ascends to Mount Zion, they will enter into the fullness of the Feast of Tabernacles. And as we mentioned, and I suppose we should probably read this because we do just have a few minutes left here, but in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 22, in Hebrews chapter 22, the author says, "But ye are come unto Mount Zion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels." He's speaking to the church and he's saying, you are called to Mount Zion. The importance of the teaching of the journey of Israel is that it takes us from Egypt all the way to Zion. And so we know that the journey doesn't complete at any one of the stops along the way. The journey completes all the way to Mount Zion. And that is our call. And in closing here this morning, I just want to commit to you one last aspect concerning Mount Zion in particular. And we have 2 Psalms that declare to us qualifications, both for ascending to Mount Zion and then also for dwelling in Mount Zion, because we need to make a distinction between the two. And as you read these different Psalms, the distinction will become obvious to you, because one says to ascend and the other says to dwell. The other says to dwell. And a pastor pointed out to us recently that it is one thing to ascend to Mount Zion, it's another thing altogether to stay there. It's another thing altogether to stay there. So that would be Psalm 15 and Psalm 24. And so we come now to the end of our study in the journey of the children of Israel. And I commend that teaching to you. It's been my privilege and my pleasure to share these thoughts with you. And I know that you're taking this course, and so you will certainly dig into the book and read a lot of the beautiful truths that we just couldn't bring out for sake of time. But you know, God bless you, and I pray that this teaching of the journey of Israel would help you to understand things that you're going through and things that you will experience as you embark and as you continue on this journey. And in the final parting thought, never give up. Never give up on ascending the hill of Zion. Never give up on that. The enemy would like to discourage. The enemy would like to knock us off course. The enemy would like us to settle the other side of Jordan. But never give up on this ministry and on this mission. Amen. God bless you, and thank you for letting me present these truths to you.